In the archives of Charleston County, there are pages so heavily redacted, they look burned. They say it's just old damage, humidity, water, time, but that's a lie. What was erased were the details of a pact, a vow made in the dark by a woman society refused to name again. Her name was Sarah Elizabeth Hafford, 32, newly widowed, living on 400 acres of silence and cotton dust. Her husband, Colonel James Hafford, had been buried barely a month. They said he died of consumption, but those who cleaned his chambers whispered of a bitter smell in his tea. By February of 1845, the townspeople began to notice changes. The widow no longer wore black. She dismissed her overseer. And most troubling of all, she began visiting the slave quarters after midnight, a lantern in hand, her blue silk gown dragging through the mud. At first, the neighbors said it was grief, then rumor, then something worse. Because one night, a child, a servant's boy, claimed to have seen her enter the cabin of a man named Isaiah. Isaiah was no ordinary slave. He was the brother of Colonel Hafford's personal servant, and by all accounts, a man whose eyes could silence a room. What the boy saw, they said, he could not describe, only that the candlelight stayed burning till dawn. Within weeks, the plantation changed. Orders were given in the widow's voice alone. Men who once took lashes for defiance now stood taller when she passed. And the air itself, heavy with moss and rumor, seemed to obey her. No preacher dared visit her home. No gentleman would speak her name, because by the spring of that year whispers spread through Charleston like fever that the Hafford widow had made an unholy union, that she had taken her slave's brother to her bed, and that the vows they exchanged, unrecorded, unrecognized, had been sealed not before a church, but before something older. The night her husband died, something awakened in her, something she would never again surrender. They told you history is written by the victors, but they never told you what happens to the records of those who win by silence. Colonel James Hafford's plantation ran differently from the rest. Fewer overseers, higher yields, strange efficiency. His neighbors envied him, but envy in Charleston was a quiet weapon. They smiled in church, then hired men to count your profits. In the colonel's private ledgers, the ones found water-damaged, edges cut clean with a blade, was something that doesn't appear in any textbook, a behavioral system centuries ahead of its time. He called it the doctrine of motivation. Every enslaved man or woman was assigned a number, a value, increase the yield, earn privileges, fall behind, lose them, a cruel calculus masked as progress. It was control disguised as opportunity, the same principle that rules the modern world, only then it wore the mask of cotton and indigo. But the ledger hid darker things, margins filled with initials, notes like recalibrated through proximity and subject shows obedience under duress. It wasn't just economics, it was experimentation. The colonel was studying psychological control. When he died, the system didn't end, it evolved. Sarah Hafford studied his books the way a priest studies forbidden scripture. Neighbors said she spent nights alone in his office, reading by candlelight until dawn, but not reading, rewriting. The ink of her handwriting flowed beside his, cold and neat. She turned the doctrine of motivation into something else, something inverted. She no longer punished defiance. She rewarded it. She looked for those who refused to break, men like Isaiah. While others saw her as fallen, she was ascending, through defiance, through scandal, through control. And Isaiah, he became the vessel of her rebellion, not just her lover, but her experiment, her mirror, her weapon. She believed what her husband began, the science of domination, could be reversed. That obedience could be unlearned. That power could be taught like a language. And beneath the magnolias, in that humid darkness, they began their lessons. By summer, she no longer resembled a widow. She looked like someone who had outgrown human law. Grief was supposed to make her invisible. That's what Charleston expected, a veiled woman, pale with loss, quiet in the back pew. But Sarah Hafford did not grieve like a widow. She reappeared. On the 12th day of February, 1845, the town gathered for Sunday service under the thick scent of candle wax and starch. The air inside St. Philip's Parish was heavy. Polite eyes, rehearsed condolences. And then she walked in, not in mourning black, but in a dress of deep blue silk, the kind worn by brides, not widows. Every head turned. The preacher stammered mid-sermon. Even the air seemed to withdraw from her path. Witnesses said she met no one's eyes, yet no one could look away. The fabric shimmered like oil when the sunlight touched it through stained glass. She did not stay for the sermon's end. She rose, glided past the pews, and vanished into daylight, like a vision leaving the body behind. That moment, the blue dress, marked the beginning of Charleston's unraveling. Neighbors whispered that her grief had curdled into madness. Others swore she'd been seen standing by the slave quarters after midnight, her hair unbound, speaking in low tones to a man whose shadow moved when hers did not. That man was Isaiah. They said she'd dismissed the overseer of 9 years, that she'd taken control of the fields, the ledgers, the men, that she'd rewritten the rules of her dead husband's empire. But beneath their gossip was something more dangerous, fascination. Because in their world of strict hierarchies, Sarah had done the unthinkable. She'd become untouchable. When you break a system, you don't just defy it, you expose its design. The same men who called her wicked secretly wanted to understand her. How she held her ground. How she looked at a man deemed beneath her and saw not a servant, but an equal, or perhaps something greater. By March, the pews where she sat were left empty by silent agreement. No one dared speak her name aloud, yet her absence echoed louder than their prayers. In Charleston's parlors, they stopped saying the widow. They started saying the witch. And every whisper carried her deeper into legend. When a society can no longer punish a woman publicly, it turns to whispers and scripture. By April of 1845, the church had made Sarah Hafford its private obsession. The Reverend Thomas Stillwell of St. Philip's Parish, a man known for his restraint and fear of scandal, began writing letters to his brother, a judge in Savannah. Those letters were meant to remain private. They were not prayers. They were confessions. The first read simply, "The widow Hafford has dismissed her overseer. The men now report directly to her. She is no longer bound by propriety. It is as though she answers to another master, unseen, but obeyed." He signed it trembling. Weeks later another followed. "Her nights are not her own. The lamps burn till morning. I have been told she walks the grounds with one of the slaves, the brother of the colonel's manservant. They say she speaks to him in whispers, not meant for mortal ears. You can feel it, the fear in the Reverend's ink, because he was witnessing not sin, but power rearranging itself. Stillwell's final surviving letter was dated June 23, 1845. It is the one the historians tried to forget. The widow has been discovered in an improper union with the man Isaiah. When we confronted her, she did not deny it. She said, "I have stood before God with him, and he saw no shame." Her eyes were clear, her voice without tremor. It was I who trembled. He wrote that she called the church a wall built by frightened men, that she believed God's law was older than paper, and that love, once sanctified by will, needed no witness. But the Reverend's terror went deeper than lust or defiance. He described a ritual, one he did not understand. A ceremony of binding that had taken place not in a chapel, but in the very house where her husband had died. 2 candles, a spoken vow, a ring that did not belong to her, and a silence so deep, he sat. It felt as though the walls themselves were listening. After that letter, Stillwell never wrote again. His parish reported his sudden illness, a fever without cause. Within a week he was dead, and the letters, sealed, hidden, waited more than a century to be read again. Some stories end with a confession. The Hafford story begins with one, though not written by the widow, nor by the Reverend who tried to stop her. It came from the Colonel himself. Hidden among the warped pages of his surviving ledger, beneath water stains and smudged ink, historians found a single line written in a trembling hand, dated 1 month before his death. "Control is not in chains, but in choice." Those 6 words were his final note, the blueprint for what would come after. Colonel James Hafford wasn't just a landowner. He was part of a quiet movement spreading through Charleston's intellectual circles. Men obsessed with human obedience. Some called it science, others called it theology. They called themselves the Order of Rational Dominion, plantation lords and academics experimenting with fear, reward, and will. Their obsession was to prove that free will could be engineered, that men, black or white, could be reprogrammed through pain and favor alike. What no one realized, not until later, was that Sarah had read every word of his research. She understood his method, but she also understood something the Colonel never could, that submission wasn't a symptom of weakness. It was a reflection of who held the mirror. Isaiah was that mirror. When Sarah freed him in secret, when she spoke those vows beside the dying embers of her husband's study, she wasn't breaking the system. She was testing it. 2 wills, one born from power, one from bondage, aligned under the same roof. And in that alignment, something ancient stirred. The ledger records show pages sliced cleanly out, their contents missing. But on the next surviving sheet, in her handwriting, appears a phrase that chills even the archivists today. The doctrine is inverted. He obeys no longer, he chooses. That's when the plantation changed. Productivity soared beyond reason. The men no longer feared the lash. They worked under her command as if possessed by purpose, not servitude. The system of control had reversed polarity. But when power shifts, it doesn't vanish. It waits for balance. And by midsummer, Charleston's balance was breaking. The order that once whispered through parlors began to stir, because one of their own, Colonel Hafford's widow, had used their own dark science against them, and that was unforgivable. Power always draws its executioners. When a woman in 1845 could command men who were never meant to stand beside her, not by threat but by choice, she became something the old order could not explain. And what can't be explained must be destroyed. On the night of August 11th, 12 men rode down Cypress Creek Road beneath a moon that hung low and red as blood. They said they came to restore order. But in Charleston, order was just another word for possession. They were armed with rifles, whiskey, and righteousness, the three pillars of Southern justice. Their torches flickered through the Spanish moss as they approached the Hafford estate. From the distance, the house looked asleep. But those who stood guard at the edge of the field knew better. Inside, Sarah Hafford had been warned. The slaves, no, her people, had seen the riders coming. She dressed not in mourning nor blue, but in her husband's dark riding coat, and at her side stood Isaiah. When the 12 men shouted for him to be delivered, Sarah stepped out onto the porch. 2 dueling pistols, her late husband's, rested steady in her hands. Behind her, 6 men held their ground, armed with tools of labor now turned into weapons. The leader of the mob, a plantation owner named Richard Pinckney, called out, "You harbor what is not yours." Her answer was calm, measured, cutting through the night air. What's mine cannot be owned. They fired a warning shot into the air. She did not flinch. She raised her pistol, and the next sound that broke the stillness was not a cry, but the click of her hammer. The sheriff's missing report, the one rediscovered in 1962, describes what followed as a standoff unlike any I have witnessed. For nearly an hour, the 2 sides stared each other down. Then, as if the night itself had made a choice, the mob turned back. But before leaving, Pinckney spat into 2. He dirt and shouted, "This abomination will not stand. We'll return with God on our side." They did not know. God had already chosen. That night, the Hafford estate became something more than land. It became a line in the sand, between the past that ruled and the future that would no longer kneel. 4 days after the standoff, Charleston expected to see the widow broken, humiliated, dragged back into silence. Instead, she walked into the courthouse alone. No escort, no lawyer, no veil. The men who had come to destroy her now watched her take the stand with a stillness that cut the room in half. She carried with her a small leather satchel, worn, water-stained, sealed in brass. Inside were the papers that would force a city to choke on its own laws. They were manumission documents, signed in December 1844, bearing the unmistakable hand of Colonel James Hafford. They declared Isaiah and his brother Thomas free men upon his death, and granted them a parcel of the plantation itself. Judge William Simmons, who had dined with the colonel for years, read the documents twice, then a third time. The ink had faded, but the signature, that proud, angular scrawl, was genuine. The courtroom murmured. The whispers sounded like rats beneath the floorboards. To question the papers would mean questioning the sanctity of a white man's will. But to accept them meant acknowledging that a black man now owned land, and the loyalty of a white woman. Sarah did not argue. She stood silent, eyes fixed on the judge, the weight of the unspoken pressing on every chest in the room. When Simmons asked how she had come into possession of these papers, she only replied, "They were where he left them. I merely read what he wrote." 3 days of deliberation followed. When the verdict came, Simmons's voice broke. The court validated the manumission. Isaiah and Thomas were legally free. But the judge ordered an investigation into the addendum, a separate document granting Isaiah land. It was then that Thomas, the colonel's servant, The quiet one who'd watched it all broke his silence. He gave testimony that would never reach daylight. He told them the colonel's death had not been unnatural. He spoke of a slow, bitter sickness, of tea that smelled like almonds, of a vial Sarah kept hidden, and the promise she whispered over her husband's dying body. You taught me control. Now I will teach you consequence. His words were recorded, sealed, and buried by order of the court. But not before one man, the clerk, wrote in the margin of that sealed record, "This woman has understood the machine. Every system has a vault, a place where truth is hidden, not to protect the people, but to protect the order." For Charleston, that vault was the courthouse of 1845. Inside it, sealed under wax, lay the testimony of Thomas, the colonel's servant, the one man who saw everything. When that record was unsealed in 1959 by historian Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, dust rose like ghosts. The ink had faded to brown, but the words still pulsed with fear. Thomas began by describing the slow decay of the colonel. He grew weaker each night, though he ate well and drank heartily. His breath smelled of bitter almonds, and his tea was prepared by none but his wife. Then came the confession that shattered every polite illusion of Charleston's past. I saw her pour it, a pale powder from a glass vial. When I looked upon her, she did not hide. She said, "He must unmake what he made." That phrase, "unmake what he made," appears again and again in the surviving fragments of Sarah's writings. It was not vengeance. It was correction. Thomas claimed that after the colonel's death, Sarah called him and Isaiah to her chamber. She showed them the same vial, its contents nearly gone, and said, "This freed him from his own design. You too will be free, if you choose to follow." He described a moment, candlelight flickering on her face, where her voice seemed not her own. He said Isaiah resisted her at first, but when she took his hand, a stillness fell upon him, and he did not speak again until dawn. The judge who heard this testimony, William Simmons, ordered it sealed, not because he doubted its truth, but because he understood its implications. In his private journal, discovered a century later, he wrote one line never meant for any sermon. If her husband studied control, she discovered its reversal, the command of will through devotion, not fear. The mind that cannot be broken can still be rewritten. He ended that entry with something almost like a prayer or a warning. There are two kinds of freedom. One is given, the other is taken. The judge retired a month later, his sanity in question. They said he would wake screaming one name, Isaiah. Every rebellion begins with paper, not fire. And in Charleston, 1845, the most dangerous weapon was a woman's signature. On September 23rd, beneath the high windows of a notary's office on Meeting Street, Sarah Elizabeth Hafford signed a deed that history was never meant to remember. 10 acres of the Hafford Plantation, fertile land that had once belonged to a colonel, a slave master, a man of respectable standing, now bore the name Isaiah Freeman, a freed man of color. The ink shimmered wetly on parchment. The notary's hand trembled as he pressed his seal. He understood, as all Charleston did, that this act was not business. It was heresy. By the law, she had done nothing wrong. By the code of her world, she had committed treason. The news spread faster than plague. By nightfall, the Mercury published an editorial on its front page. A new danger stalks our community, not by blade or fire, but by ink. A widow's delusion threatens to unbind the sacred hierarchy ordained by Providence itself. The paper did not print her name, but everyone knew. They called it the unnatural arrangement. They said the devil had whispered in her ear, that Isaiah had bewitched her, that this union was the seed of a curse that would rot the soil itself. But Sarah walked the streets as if she no longer heard them. Because she didn't. She had transcended their language, that currency of judgment, gossip, and fear. She spoke now in action, in defiance, in the currency of power redefined. Isaiah, now legally free, continued to live at Hafford. The same men who had once whipped him now lowered their eyes when he passed, and when they saw him walking the grounds beside her, not behind her, they felt something cold and new, the recognition of their own irrelevance. For the first time, Charleston's empire of order felt a tremor, not because one woman loved one man, but because she had proven that ownership itself was an illusion, a lie that collapses the moment both sides stop believing it. That night, under the same moss-draped trees where her husband had once commanded obedience, Sarah whispered to Isaiah, "Freedom is not what they give you. It's what they can't take back." The next morning, smoke rose from Hafford's fields. Not from harvest. From vengeance. It was said the flames could be seen from 5 miles down Cypress Creek Road. A red bloom rising against the dark horizon, the Hafford estate, burning like an accusation. But every fire begins with breath. And that breath belonged to Charleston's concerned citizens. They came under the cover of night, a congregation of fear disguised as virtue. Men who had once dined in Sarah's parlor now rode with masks over their faces, torches in their hands, and scripture in their mouths. They told themselves they came to restore decency. But what they came to do was erase proof that a woman had rewritten their God. At 11:03 p.m., according to the sheriff's later report, a passerby saw movement near the plantation gates. At 11:17, the first gunshot cracked. At 11:24, the main house was engulfed. Witnesses said they heard a woman's voice, calm, unhurried, rising above the chaos. "You cannot burn what's already been reborn." By the time Sheriff Thompson arrived, the building was a skeleton of glowing wood and collapsing glass. No bodies were recovered. No survivors were reported. No evidence remained of Sarah or Isaiah, only the heat, the silence, and a faint scent of almond in the air. Charleston declared it an accident. A candle left unattended, they said, an unfortunate end to a tragic woman. And just like that, the ledger closed. But fires tell the truth when men cannot. The soil of the plantation stayed black for decades, refusing to yield cotton again. The locals called it the widow's curse. Children were warned not to walk too close at night, where the ground still smoked long after the rain. Yet the real story didn't die there. Because 13 years later, in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of a small church in Florida, workers found a leather journal, 2 gold bands, and a daguerreotype of a white woman and a black man. The inscription, Ben, it read only, "To live free, we had to die first." The handwriting matched Sarah's. So if the Hafford house burned, what exactly was it that Charleston buried? Ashes, or evidence that the experiment had succeeded. Because every system that feeds on control fears one thing above all. When the subjects learn, they can rewrite the design. History calls them missing. But the truth is, They were never lost. They simply moved beyond reach. In 1948, while renovating an abandoned church near Lake Monroe, Florida, workers prying up floorboards uncovered a narrow wooden compartment. Inside lay a dust-coated journal, a pair of gold wedding bands, and a faded daguerreotype of a man and woman, her hand on his chest, his gaze steady, defiant, unbroken. The ink inside the journal was fragile, but the words survived. The writer identified himself only as I.F., Isaiah Freeman. His first entry was dated November 1845, barely a month after the Halford fire. We fled through the pines while Charleston burned behind us. She did not look back. She said the past cannot follow if you walk fast enough. The journal chronicled their journey through Georgia's backwoods, traveling under false names, guided by those who owed allegiance to neither North nor South, only to freedom. By 1846, they had settled near a small settlement of free black families, calling themselves husband and wife. Sarah, now known as Mrs. Freeman, began teaching, but not scripture, not sewing. Her students were taught to read the language of power. Isaiah wrote, "She told the men who gathered that freedom is not granted by law or by blood, but by the ability to see the design and step outside it." She called it the doctrine inverted. It was the same phrase found years later in her husband's ledger, turned upside down. Her teaching spread quietly, carried through whispers, coded prayers, and the letters of men who could barely sign their names. They were not lessons of rebellion. They were instructions for sovereignty. She taught them to resist command not by violence, but by refusing to internalize it, to see obedience as illusion. To understand the true power lay not in the master's hand, but in the slave's recognition of his own wit. Oh, for 16 years they lived this way, invisible but free. Until March 1861, when Isaiah's final entry appeared. News of war reaches even here. S. says this is the harvest she foresaw, the fire spreading north. She says, when systems fall, they do not die, they transform. His last line, scrawled shakily, read, "If you have found this, you are part of it now." When they found Isaiah's journal, they thought it was a love story. They were wrong. It was a manual, a framework for how to unmake control itself. The Doctrine Inverted was never written as a book. It was spoken, coded, whispered from teacher to student. But scattered fragments, from Isaiah's notes, Sarah's handwriting in the margins, and the recollections of those she taught, reveal its core truth. Obedience is not forced, it is learned, and what is learned can be unlearned. Sarah understood something no man of her time, or ours, dared to admit. Every empire, every hierarchy, every system of power survives only because those beneath it believe in its legitimacy. The moment they stop believing, the system collapses under its own weight. This was her heresy. She inverted the very psychology her husband had studied, the blueprint of dominance, and discovered that the mind conditioned to submit could be reprogrammed to resist without rebellion. She taught her students to use the system's own language against it. When ordered, they nodded, but did not internalize. When judged, they smiled, but did not absorb. When punished, they withdrew inward, building strength in silence. The Colonel had called it the doctrine of motivation. Sarah renamed it the Doctrine Inverted. One ruled through fear of loss. The other ruled through the refusal of fear itself. She told Isaiah once, according to his journal, "The only real master is the one who controls how you think about yourself." That idea was too powerful to die with her. It moved quietly, like an underground current, through the Reconstruction years, into sharecroppers' hymns, coded sermons, the writings of early black preachers who spoke of inner dominion. They thought it was faith. It was training. And here's the truth they never told you. The same psychological systems used by plantation lords to contact pimps, role labor, fear, reward, isolation, dependency, were never abolished. They were modernized. Corporations, governments, institutions, different uniforms, same design. The Hafford plantation may have burned, but its experiment didn't end there. It evolved from fields of cotton to offices of glass. So when you hear words like order, structure, compliance, remember, those are the echoes of Charleston's old theology of control. And every echo has an origin. Every forbidden idea needs a vessel. And when its author dies, the idea seeks new blood. The world forgot Sarah Hafford's name, but her doctrine inverted didn't die in the ashes of 1845. It survived the only way dangerous truth ever does, by hiding inside other names. After the Civil War, whispers of a teacher from the South appeared in the oral histories of freedmen's schools along the Carolina coast. They spoke of a woman with pale eyes who taught not scripture, but awareness. She told them, "Freedom without understanding is just another kind of leash." Some believed she was a myth, an archetype of rebellion. But in 1871, a pamphlet surfaced in Savannah's archives, unsigned, titled, "On the Dominion of the Mind." Its author wrote, "The human being is not owned when his body is bound, but when his will aligns with another's." It used phrases identical to those in Isaiah's journal. By the early 1900s, fragments of this philosophy had seeped into black intellectual circles, encoded in sermons, passed through teachers, poets, and radicals who understood what Sarah had meant, that systems are not destroyed by chaos, but by clarity. And somewhere between sermons and speeches, between secret meetings and academic theory, a lineage formed. You can trace its fingerprints. In Booker T. Washington's quiet insistence on self-mastery before protest. In W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, seeing the system and oneself at once. In early labor movements, in psychological studies on compliance, even in classified wartime experiments that studied moral conditioning. No one knew it then, but Sarah's inverted doctrine had infiltrated the minds of both the oppressed and the powerful. Each side weaponized it differently. The oppressed used it to survive, the powerful to refine their control. That's the paradox of truth. Once released, it serves anyone who can understand it. And in the modern world, where men sit before screens, convinced of their own freedom, her experiment has reached perfection. No whips, no overseers, only invisible authority. Control is no longer enforced. It's chosen, willingly, repeatedly, by those who mistake comfort for liberty. Charleston's ghost lives not in the ruins of the Hafford estate. It lives every time a man trades his will for belonging. Every time obedience feels like peace. Look around you. Do you think the plantation died? No. It evolved. Traded fields of cotton for fields of data, overseers for algorithms, and chains for choices that don't feel like chains at all. You wake when they tell you. You scroll when they feed you. You work for numbers that exist on screens. And you call it freedom. Sarah Hafford saw this coming before there were even machines. Her doctrine, Inverted wasn't about rebellion. It was about seeing the pattern. She said, "Once you see the strings, you stop dancing for applause." That's why her story was erased, not because she poisoned her husband, not because she loved Isaiah, but because she uncovered the design, the invisible architecture of control. And once you understand it, you can't unsee it. They still use the same techniques: isolation, fear of loss, manufactured dependence. In the 1800s, they called it obedience. Today, they call it engagement. Back then, they offered food and shelter for loyalty. Now, they offer attention and validation. Different century, same plantation. And the question is no longer, who owns you? It's, what do you serve without realizing you're serving it? Sarah's defiance wasn't just against Charleston's laws. It was against the psychology of submission itself. She inverted her husband's system of reward and punishment and taught Isaiah the highest form of resistance, the ability to choose what defines you. And that's where you come in, because stories like this aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to awaken. You didn't find this video. It found you. And if you've watched this far, you've already begun to remember what they worked so hard to make you forget. That control only exists when you consent to it. So I'll ask you something dangerous, something only those ready to awaken can do. Comment this phrase twice below to lock in what you now know, to signal that you've stepped beyond the veil. I see the design. Type it once for awareness. Type it twice for transformation. Because that's how it begins. One realization at a time, until obedience loses its grip and you start to think like her. They say legends die when no one remembers them. But Sarah Hafford was never a legend. She was a blueprint. In 1962, during courthouse renovations in Charleston, a janitor discovered a locked iron box hidden behind a crumbling plaster wall. Inside were documents, burned at the edges, and one letter sealed with black wax. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. It read, "If the fire found you, it was meant to. If the truth found you, you were ready. We did not die. We became what they feared. Awake." The letter was unsigned, but on its final line, written in faint pencil, was a name, S. Freeman. Her last alias. Her new identity. She had lived, and she had left instructions. After that discovery, the documents vanished into private collections. The box itself was misplaced, but fragments leaked into universities, into circles of historians who studied forbidden archives, into the speeches of men who spoke of sovereignty, and into the quiet movements that taught one radical belief: that no man, no system, no law defines the self, only will does. And that belief, her belief, still moves. In boardrooms, in back rooms, in the quiet rebellion of those who refuse to be owned. Because Sarah Hafford was not a witch. She was not a murderer. She was the first to see the mechanism of control, and the first to break it. She did what few dare to do. She inverted the hierarchy. She made obedience irrelevant. She made power circular, no longer top-down, but inward. And that's why history erased her. But erasure is never perfect. You've seen her now, through these words, through this descent. You've felt her shadow move through time, whispering that power isn't taken or given. It's recognized. So when you look in the mirror tonight, and the world feels smaller than your will. Remember her. Remember the widow who burned her past to build a future no one else could imagine. And if you can still hear her voice, calm, unwavering, dangerous, don't be afraid. It's not a haunting, it's an invitation. Because once you see the design, you become it.